Our focus today is how higher education institutions can move toward more linguistically inclusive environments for international students, not only in terms of policy, but also in everyday classroom practices and institutional culture and beyond. We'll begin with brief opening remarks from each panelist for 5 minutes. And this will be followed by a guided discussion for 6 questions. And we will leave time toward the end for the questions from the audience. So please, people online or in person, feel free to jump in at that time and ask your question, and you can note your questions as well. And it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. We are joined by speakers who bring diverse perspectives from research, teaching, and lived experience. Let's start with Dr. Michael Koslowski. He's the coordinator of OISE Student Success Center. He completed his PhD research at OISE, focusing on the construction of monolingual and multilingual binary for institutional and classroom language policies. He has an extensive experience in advising international students on their papers and scholarly projects. Michael also has over 15 years of experience. He calls it veteran of English language teaching, with a plurilingual pedagogical perspective, and has held course directorships in English as a second language and academic writing in higher education. I'd like to also introduce our second panelist, Dr. Vijay Ramjattan. He's an assistant professor in language and disease education at the Department of Curriculum Teaching and Learning at OISE. He also completed his PhD research at OISE, focusing on intersections of language, race, and work in the context of education particularly. He has a great deal of publications critiquing deficit lenses towards international students, and he is advocating anti-racist approaches. He conceptualizes international not as a straightforward legal designation, but rather a racial and colonial category, particularly about language. We also have Dr. Shakina Rajendram today with us. She's also an assistant professor in the language and disease education in the same department with Vijay. She also completed her PhD research here at OISE. It's like quite OISE event today. And yes, her research focused on translanguaging as a transformative and collaborative pedagogy for multilingual learners. She has over 12 years of experience of teaching linguistically and culturally diverse students in K-12 and higher education. And she has also a wide range of publications on international students' experience of multilingual pedagogies and academic language development. So to start us off, I'd like to invite to share their opening remarks, starting with Michael. Michael, floor is yours. Please go ahead. And sorry, I should maybe tell the prompt to the audience so they know what question you answer. For this part of the event, we have an opening prompt for 5-minute opening remarks. How do you see language shaping the experiences of international students in higher education? And why is it important to foster inclusive practices? How does your research and professional experience relate to this issue?
Thank you, Emre. So happy to be here. International students bring an incredible range of linguistic and cultural funds of knowledge to higher education. And so inclusive practices have needed to shift framing from a deficit to an asset perspective, and bringing international students in as collaborators, key contributors to our collective knowledge creation, research, and scholarly activity. I would say also takes impressive courage, aptitude, and resolve to take a graduate degree in an additional language. I try to imagine myself doing so in Japanese. It's not going to happen. So these are some of the important qualities that international students are exhibiting and developing. As far as my professional experience, I'll tell you a little bit about my story. I taught English overseas for 10 years, and then kind of came back to Canada, did some grad school, and have been teaching kind of English for academic purposes for 10 years. And I remember when I was teaching abroad, there was this uncomfortable kind of missionary, colonial, westernizing aspect to it. But at the same time, kind of without any real training, I was kind of a staunch advocate of these kind of English-only policies as a teacher. And so I told students to put away their bilingual dictionaries, to think in English, to dream in English, And I didn't realize the kind of damage that was kind of conveying, right? And then I came back to Canada, did an MA in applied linguistics, and was kind of surprised to find out that I was kind of doing it all wrong. There's overwhelming support for multiple languages, cultures, and perspectives in the classroom. And so I began to experiment with kind of translanguaging pedagogy in my EAP classes to positive effect, seeing a lot of kind of gains there from the students. I also found kind of difficulties with kind of Japanese only practices as a learner, often feeling lost, a little confused, wanting to ask questions of how does that work? So I was inspired to explore the disconnect between research, which is much more kind of plurilingual, and then practice in the ELT field, which was much more monolingual, as I'd experienced as a teacher, to help start to shift things in a plurilingual direction. So my research looks at post-secondary English language instructors' beliefs, policies, and practices on kind of a mono to multi continuum, comparing the context of Canada and Japan. And kind of one of the main takeaways is this kind of multilingual or plurilingual turn from the findings of my research is taking place. There's the shift is happening away from monolingual policies and practices. I might talk about that a little bit more. At the same time, there's much work to be done insofar as there's not a whole lot of kind of plurilingual policies, like on the institution level, let's say, in post-secondary ELT. And those are my opening remarks.
Thanks so much, Michael. Now we can pass the word to Vijay to share his opening remarks.
So hi everyone, and thank you very much, Emre, for the invitation. So I guess the way that I'll answer the question is thinking more in general in terms of the themes of my research. So for international students and this topic of language, I see language as a site of oppression for international students, but it's also a site of resistance at the same time. So, for many of us, myself included, we have this very functionalist understanding of language, right? Language is this technical tool for communication, right? It has nothing to do with, race or gender or class. We see it in this very neoliberal way, just as this neutral medium of communication once again. But for international students, language is a way that they experience various types of oppression, right? So various isms like racism, and phobias like xenophobia, etc. So for international students, there's this bind, right? They have to learn language or master language to succeed in academic settings, but they also need to, they don't need to, they do experience, oppression on the basis of their language practices. So for me, in terms of like my research and professional interests, I think of how international students are made to be linguistically deficient, right? So when international students enter spaces like OISE, they're not coming as already deficient, right? The way that they're treated, the policies that they have to adhere to, the curricula that they have to learn, right? All of these factors create linguistic deficiencies for them, right? These are not natural things that they come into institutional spaces with. So in terms of my specific, research and professional interests, I'm really interested in the politics of accent, and how we can listen better to the accents of international students and any locally marginalized, speaker of English. So, I think I'll just leave it there in terms of my remarks, but I basically ask us to interrogate how we individually and institutionally perceive the language practices of international students, basically.
Thanks so much, Vijay. Such a great remarks. And let's pass the word to Shakina now.
Well, thank you, first of all, for the invitation to be here, Emre. Thank you for this amazing panel. Thank you to all of you for being here and for being curious and interested in this important topic. Such a great space to have a discussion. I think for me, similarly to what Vijay, you were saying, I see language not as a skill that students bring or that students lack or that students have to acquire, but really, again, building on what Michael and Vijay said, language is a structuring force that shapes students' experiences at multiple levels. So even before they get to higher education, think about all of the gatekeeping mechanisms that they have to pass in order to get into university, right? The language proficiency testing, the high stakes English test that all function as gatekeeping mechanisms. And so they already have this message that they're internalizing before even stepping foot into the university, that their legitimacy as students depends on whether they're able to perform in one variation of standard academic English and their test scores. Many of them are subjected to just becoming a number at the end of the day. Like, what's your IELTS score? 7.5, yes, admit. And this is speaking as someone who's an insider in the admissions process. And then once they are here in university, it really shapes the day-to-day academic participation, their learning, in terms of what counts as legitimate knowledge, whose writing style is valued, what kinds of academic publication norms they encounter, what kinds of participation are seen as professional and what's seen as academic. So it's language is very much the way that they experience education. It also shapes not just the academic experiences, but their social, emotional well-being. And we're going to go deeper into this in questions later on. Students often, in my research, at least I should qualify this, when I spoke to international students, they talk about, the anxiety that they feel coming into an English-only space, the sense of being less than. And I started my PhD here at OISE a few months after I moved to Canada. I wasn't legally an international student. I moved here as a permanent resident, but having only moved here a few months before my PhD, not knowing anyone, not speaking English really as my first language, I really felt that sense of, wow, I've had a whole life before this. I have taught, I have done other degrees, but now I feel like a no one because I'm so conscious about my accent and how different I sound when I speak out loud and the different ways that I'm speaking. And so it was like my life before OISE was sort of erased, and I felt like it wasn't valued because of the English-only norms that I encountered when I first did my PhD here. So the other part of the question was, why is it important to foster inclusive practices? And that's why we're here today. I'm sure we'll delve deeper into this later on. But I want to just maybe say for now that a lot of language supports and academic supports for international students stem from this perspective that we're helping to fix a problem. We're helping to fix their English. But with linguistically inclusive practices, we're shifting that narrative from helping to fix a problem to how do we change the university to create conditions where multilingual students are the norm and they can thrive academically. And I look forward to talking later about the practical realities and limitations of that. How my research connects. So back when I was a PhD student, a side project was I looked at with a few other PhD colleagues, we looked at high stakes English tests like the IELTS and TOEFL. We looked at international students' experiences navigating these tests, but also the kind of mismatch between what they're expected to do and perform in the language of testing and in standardized academic language versus the actual realities, the challenges, the affordances of graduate study, and to look at, what are we actually expecting students to do when we tell them to pay thousands to get a certain level at the IELTS and TOEFL? Are we actually preparing them for graduate study? Or are we creating an unequal burden on them? Right now, my study, I look at the current experiences of international students, specifically from the global South, looking at how they experience English-only practices, but also how they push back against them. I like what you said earlier about language is a side of oppression, but also resistance. I was making a lot of points about the challenges that students face, and I felt really conflicted because I was using a lot of negative terminology, like they're anxious, they feel less than this, they feel worried. But students, yeah, they do experience these real negative emotions, but they're also creative. They push back against English only norm. They find ways to invest in multilingual resources. And so my research with international students tries to really showcase that as well, them as not being less than, but being more than the English only norms that they encounter. I also look at what effective support for multilingual students can look like beyond the EAP course over there or the writing center over there, and look at thinking about how instructors can actually integrate multilingual practices such as translanguaging and plurilingualism to better support students, what that means in terms of curriculum and assessment and changing structures and so on. And yeah, we'll get deeper into that later on.
Yeah, this was like great remarks and introduction. We already touched upon like policy pedagogy and practices, but also like individual agencies of individual and collective agencies of international students. This is great. We can now move forward to the guided discussion part. We will start with this question. How do you think English-only institutional policies in higher education influences the academic, social, emotional experiences of multilingual international students? In what ways do these policies reinforce or challenge power dynamics, inclusion, and equity for these students. We will start with Shakina. She already introduced the topic, but we can go deeper and talk about English only policies now.
Okay, sure. Yeah, English only policies. Well, English only norms, they shape what counts as real academic work in university spaces. And so with the research that I did, interviewing international students, I found that a lot of them, yes, they're agentive, they're creative, but the use of multilingual practices, specifically their first language, their home language, bilingual tools, and so on, was often relegated to the margins, to informal spaces. For example, I would do it during a peer group discussion, but not during a whole class discussion. Or I will do it when I'm reading an article in preparation for class, but I would never dare do it in an assignment, right? And so English only norms really, end up pushing the multilingual resources of students to the margins, to the shadows, and informal academic spaces, in order for students to be seen as legitimate members, as scholars in training, they end up not taking the risk of using their multilingual resources in formal academic spaces because of the fear that they may be again seen as less competent or less professional. And so the students that we interviewed, when we talked about, we asked them about instructors who do encourage the use of first languages and whether they would take up their instructors offer. And they said, yes, I have this really amazing professor over here. And she says, you can use any language, but I'd still prefer not to because I'm already an outsider. I'm already, as an international student, I already feel like an other, whether I'm othered by the institution or whether I'm othering myself. And now if I'm the only one in a group of 25 who chooses to, break out in a few words of Mandarin when I'm speaking, I'm marking myself as like more different and more othered, right? And so students, even when given that sort of permission by their instructors, because of the internalized English only norms from way back, from when they did their undergrad, from when they were in high school, from when they were in elementary school, many of them, they end up, just choosing to be socialized into the English only norms. And in terms of how this influences their academic experiences, it really limits, this is pretty obvious, but it limits the quality of learning and knowledge building that actually happens. Students, and I'll talk about myself, as a PhD student who just moved to Canada, I spent so much time sort of, staying in English in my head because of Michael, the teachers who told me that try to think in English and try to dream in English. And so I spend so much energy monitoring my own language. Is my accent really bad? How do I pronounce this word so I sound more Canadian? Is my grammar correct? That I wasn't always able to engage deeply with the ideas and just listen. Like many times in my courses as a PhD student, I would spend so much time like trying to construct the perfect sentence in my head that I missed out on just listening to what was happening in the classroom, and just really being engaging and being present in that classroom. And so it really reduces the range of academic voices that are present in the classroom. It discourages risk-taking. And from a language learning perspective, the more risk you take in a language, the better, for many people, like the better your language improves, like when you're taking a risk in a language. And so when students silence themselves, like actually they're not benefiting academically, they're not benefiting linguistically either. In terms of social and emotional experiences, with group dynamics, students feeling like judged for our accent, and Vijay, the accent expert here, I'm sure you'll have a lot to say about that. Whether students are in front of the classroom as a TA, whether I'm in front of the classroom as an instructor or as a student, just the fear of being, judged for an accent. Again, it limits the kind of participation, the kinds of participation. It limits the opportunities for authentic relationship building, between students who sound different and who look different. And it continues to reinforce outsider feelings. And then you asked about how these policies reinforce or challenge power dynamics, inclusion, and equity. And so in the research, again, with the interviews with students, they talk about how it's not just a matter of language, right? It's a matter of which knowledge counts. And so when English is treated as the center of instruction and the medium of instruction, by association, we're also putting the knowledge from English-speaking countries at the center of instruction. And we're pushing, again, knowledges and philosophies of learning, epistemologies from other contexts to the side, which really reinforces the center-periphery divisions of the global north and global south sort of division. And so students, they explicitly link English only norms to hierarchy. They started, talking, they used words like English feels more powerful in this classroom. French feels more powerful in this particular context. My languages don't feel as powerful, therefore I don't feel as powerful because identity is so tied to your language. And so, I'll close by saying that English only policies, they may feel neutral, or they may feel like it's just about language, but it's about way more than language, as Michael and Vijay has spoken about. They really structure who can participate, who gets heard, who feels credible, and who feels like they belong and don't belong.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Such a deep conversation. Anything other panels would would like to add? Michael?
To go back.
Sure. We can be going.
Okay, yeah, Shakina already gave like a very comprehensive answer, so I don't have much to add. I think just the whole notion of English itself, and this might lead us into the second question, actually. So, with English only policies, it's oftentimes one type of English that's being enforced, right? So this standardized North American type of English in a place like OISE, for example, is often the unspoken norm or the unspoken policy. So even if you're speaking or using another type of English, just say so-called, Indian English, Nigerian English, right? That's often not seen as, good enough English in certain academic spaces. So once again, these, as Shakina already said very well, is just like these policies limit your linguistic repertoire. So even if you're using a different type of English, you have different ways to express yourself in English, those are already shut down, right? To use Shakina's language, right? They're sort of pushed to the margins. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, and I guess just as like an English only convert or convert away from English only, we kind of have to, understand and call them out as a manifestation of linguistic imperialism, colonialism, English hegemony, and they need to be deconstructed. In my research, I used deconstruction to kind of think about how do we break down these binaries. So binaries like L1, L2, English, other languages, or as Vijay talks about, like international student, domestic student, right? So when we deconstruct these things, it reveals contingency. The binaries and categories are socially constructed, and they're built to kind of privilege certain groups and certain ends of the binary. Reveal complexity, diversity, multiplicity of meanings and possibilities. So again, shifting away from English only versus other languages to more integrated kind of plurilingual or translanguaging pedagogy and practices. So again, just touching on what I said previously from my research, I'm going to get a little bit quantitative here on everyone. I looked at institutional policies in the Canadian EAP context. And this is self-report, so it's not, I didn't look at the policies themselves, the documents, but teachers self-reporting on their institutional policies. And so on a kind of spectrum from strict English only to encouraging, the institution encourages other languages, right? So we had 2% strict English only, 36% kind of lenient English only. So there's kind of a policy or a culture in the institution, but it's not necessarily enforced or followed heavily. 55% no policy or kind of agnostic. And then 7% where the institution would allow other languages, and then 0 that actually encouraged other languages, right? So, and there was kind of tangential qualitative evidence of this too, where teachers were talking about, there used to be English only signs in the computer lab and in the hallways, and there'd be penalties for, non-English use. One kind of instructor had kind of a policy where if you spoke another language, you'd have to pay $1 in to the class party. And he said, I can't do that online. And I was like, well, just e-transfer, they could send e-transfer. So just the problematic aspect of all those things, right? But now the kind of signs have disappeared, right? And kind of those kind of policies are kind of waning, right? So that's the kind of good news, again, from my research. But again, a lot of work still needs to be done. Again, that kind of 7% where they allow the languages as a institutional policy, and then none of them actually encouraging the use, right? So again, the shift is taking place, but and thanks to scholars like these, but there's a lot more work to be done. So we'll leave it at that.
I think it was a great ending because now we will talk about what we can do, and our question is, and how to transform institutions. What perspectives could potentially challenge traditional ideas of correct and standard English in academic professional context? How could we spread more inclusive perspectives such as global Englishes on campuses and in workplaces? I'd like to start with Vijay in this question.
Yeah, thank you, Emre, for that. Yes, I guess the way I'll start is like, first of all, I think the whole notion of English, we have to challenge this idea that it's a monolithic, stable kind of concept or entity, right? So I see that Dr. Yassine Alim is in the Zoom audience, so I'm going to use Yassine's terminology. So he uses the term Englishing, right? So for him and similar scholars, they don't see English as a sort of, once again, this stable monolithic system. English is this dynamic, messy, complex practice. So I think like the first thing that we all have to sort of collectively appreciate is, once again, English isn't this one static thing. It's something that can change over time through interactions and so on, right? So in terms of like, for me, in terms of like my teaching, one thing that I like to do for students and colleagues is just show them rather than tell them. Because I can tell, I can say that English is, this practice, it's not a system, but people are not going to appreciate that, right? So I think what I like to do in my practice is just like show people, once again, how English is actually used. So like in the context of like a workplace, for example, I don't know, is anybody a pilot here by any chance? No, or in the Zoom room? Okay, no, so if anybody knows anything about like piloting and like aviation English, right? The English that's used in that context is not so-called standardized, North American English, right? They don't always pronounce the theta sound phoneme, so they would say t instead of th, right? For many types of, words and phrases. So, the way that we use English can be done successfully in different contexts, and people aren't complaining. Right, we still understand each other, right? As long as intelligibility is achieved, right? We don't necessarily have to focus too much on the form of English being used, right? So I think in terms of like what we can do or can appreciate, once again, we need to show and research and analyze how English is actually used in institutions like OISE or in different workplaces, and really appreciate, once again, that there isn't one way to successfully communicate in English, right? You can do it in a myriad of ways. So I think, just once again, I'll just plug Yassine's work, because he talks more about this in terms of the notion of Englishing, right? So if we're looking at specific scholarly perspectives, I would say, read his thesis, his dissertation when it comes out on T-Space. And then, another thing I wanted to add as well, in terms of scholarly perspectives, I know many of us probably know these scholars already, but Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa, so they talk about the notion of racial-linguistic ideologies, right? And so when we think about like academic English, for example, right, we think of this as this set of features, right? These concrete, stable features, but oftentimes who sounds academic or what is perceived as academic really depends on the racialized person, right? So for somebody like me who's racialized as brown, I'm not always perceived as using English in an academic manner, right? But if somebody racialized as white is saying the exact same thing, well, they're so articulate and really trustworthy and intelligent, right? So when it comes to like this notion of Englishes, right? Who gets to speak in a particular type of English can affect how that English is received, right? So we need to interrogate that some more. So I realize I'm not giving like coherent answers as well as Michael and Shakina, but that's kind of my style. And hopefully you understood. I made myself understand in my remarks, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Vijay. Anything?
Yeah, just a short point to add to build on to what you're saying. So you talked about racial linguistics. For those of you who don't know racial linguistics, to put it simply, it's a related term called the white listening subject. So it talks about how like racialized people, when they speak, they're listened to through a white listening subject and the white listening subject doesn't need to be white, right? It's someone who just kind of embodies that standard language or standard accent. And so the way that they perceive you as someone who speaks with a marked accent, who's racialized, that determines like how proficient you are. And so, for example, if Michael is amazing, but if Michael listens to me as a racialized person with an accent and thinks that Shakina doesn't really speak in a standard language, then I'm always marked as someone who's non-standard or who's always deficient in my language, no matter what benchmark I hit with my IELTS and TOEFL with the CFR, right? Because I'm listened to through the white listening subject. So sorry, that was just a little bit of a teaching moment. But to bring it back to the idea of correct standard English, it made me think that earlier when you talked about intelligibility, and your question about how can we challenge the idea of correct and standard English, I realized that we do a lot of courses and classes on how to like speak better, right? oral presentation skills, the GCAC. I taught that course for many years, so academic conversation skills. But I think we need to, why don't we start teaching people to listen better, to understand better? Because if we shifted from getting everyone to speak better to like getting everyone to understand better, then if everyone or more people are able to understand different kinds of accents and different kinds of speaking English and other languages, then that becomes the norm. And so then we're really challenging the idea that there is a standard English if people are able to understand better. Remember, again, my first semester here at a PhD, I had a professor who would always, anytime I said something, they would always say, "Pardon? Sorry, I didn't understand that. Pardon?" And I felt so bad and so conscious about my language. And maybe it was just maybe it was just honestly a hearing thing and they weren't able to hear me because of the audio in the room. But it made me feel like there was a problem with my speaking because they weren't able to understand me. And so if the onus wasn't on the speaker to speak better, but on the listener to listen better, that might be one way of breaking down the whole idea that there is one way to speak.
This is a great idea to mention like how we can educate our ears rather than just trying to fix our speaking skills. I think this is an issue that all international students, including myself, when we come here first, we experience that people don't understand us. When we have a like very particular accent and we start changing it so we could be understood by others. And this is important that rather than pointing out to students, like educating public about different accents, different Englishes is a good idea. Anything you would like to add, Michael?
Yeah, maybe just one point. And yeah, again, I think that's amazing, that this idea of like the white listening subject. And just thinking about how all language is inherently kind of hybrid, and English, or so-called English, again, the different varieties. So if you look at the development of the English language, I did my undergrad in English literature. We had to try to read like old English texts, and basically I was not able to understand them because they're heavily Germanic, right? There's a part of Northern Holland where they speak kind of almost similar kind of dialect to Old English, right? And the Normans conquered England for 200 years, and all of these Latin roots were infused, right? So table is table en français, and book is Buch in German, right? So English is inherently a hybrid, right? It's inherently complex, dynamic, diverse, right? In all those aspects. So this idea that the standard English itself is a myth. The varieties of so-called kind of native speaker Englishes, right? You go to Glasgow and try to, this is maybe the white listening subject, but try to understand a Glaswegian accent. Very challenging, right? So English is no longer the property, and never has been the property of the so-called native speakers. There's varieties of English everywhere, whether they're so-called native or non-native, right? I remember having a conversation with someone in Belize, a friend of a friend, and he was apologizing for not only his accent, but his variety of English, that it was a kind of Creole hybrid. And I was like, no, beyond kind of standard English, your English is much, he talked about it as kind of a broken English, right? It's not broken, it's, it's more creative, there's complexity, there's hybridity. So looking at that as a value rather than just kind of, the standard aspect, and what's pushed in that sense is actually quite boring in comparison, right? So that's what I'd say about standard English.
Thanks so much for those points, and we can continue with the third question. And this is more about university administrations. I know some of our audience would like to hear about how can administrative stuff can change the higher education. So our question is, how could university administrations recognize, include, and promote the use of multiple languages on campuses? What is the role of language centers such as GCAC, Graduate Center for Academic Communication, for those who are not at UofT, and OSSC, which Michael coordinates, can do in implementing those policies?
For sure. And I've been in administration for not very long, so I'll give my best shot. It's a lot of sitting in front of a computer. And I miss being in front of students. So yeah, first of all, I think on the administrative level, Shakina was part of this too. I think there's lots of positive initiatives to facilitate kind of international student transition to the higher education context or culture in Canada, because educational cultures can be a little bit different. So there's a project called Onboard at OISE with an academic writing group. where international students kind of develop writing skills and build community, and maybe have some of these conversations questioning the kind of standard academic English. An academic skills hub, introduction to, for example, reflective writing, which might be new to some contexts. And then like an OISE welcome kit about how to thrive in your courses, how to maybe navigate some of these kind of whitelisting subject aspects, introduction to EDI, those kind of things, right? So I think that's one aspect. And then on Shakina's point about how can we change the university to a multilingual space, I remember Jeff Bale talking about, it's always, the conversation will always like, how can we help international students transition and change to be able to succeed in our context? And we need to start thinking about how can we adjust and change. So it can't just be a one-way street of adjustment, right? And then on multiple languages, so looking at and promoting centers as linguistically inclusive spaces with multilingual advisors that can work with students in multiple languages. Helping students develop their own kind of writerly or personal voice, which can include different registers, but beyond the traditional academic, different rhetorical styles, different languages that express their identities and goals. Conversations on navigating institutional policies and expectations around standardized English. Those can happen in those kind of writing centers to again challenge the power structures that see deficit rather than asset. And then I think there's a unique kind of aspect now of the ability to leverage technology. So I remember working in writing centers where we were, oftentimes focused on the kind of sentence level, the grammatical aspects, verb tenses, things like that. That's basically been outsourced now. Technology can take care of that, and so we can focus on things like creativity, critical thinking, personal voice, right? So I think in all those aspects, that's maybe where these centers can come in.
Yeah, thanks so much. Great points and advice. What would you like to add, Vijay?
Yeah, this is kind of like somebody who doesn't work in an administrative role at the moment. It's kind of hard to add anything to Michael's remarks, but I would say like kind of what's alluded in Michael's remarks that I was listening to is just like this idea that we need resources, right? All of these things require, money, time, dedication from, institutional members of places like OISE. So I think, we also have to put our money where our mouths are, right? So it really requires us to advocate, right? For like, to the dean or whoever. I'm terrible with like finance stuff, so I don't know who we would talk to, but I think you need material resources basically to do a lot of the great suggestions that Mike already mentioned. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Yeah, material and human resources. So many students we interviewed, and this might be a suggestion from Michael in your role. They talked about the writing center and how they would love to see more linguistically diverse writing advisors. Some of them talked about the writing challenges, and they would bring, how they would bring a piece of writing to the writing center, but they would have an advisor who was very trained in academic writing, and who was very proficient in English, but who wasn't able to really understand where they were coming from in terms of what they were speaking in their first language, or the specific differences between English and their first language. And so they talked about how there was always a roadblock, like there wasn't someone who could really understand what I'm trying to say in my first language. Maybe with technology, with AI and so on, it could be a little bit easier. But I think, and I know that there are practical constraints there, but diversifying hiring practices is a top suggestion that our students in my research project would bring up. And specifically, they mentioned diversifying writing instructors.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Shakina. Now we can continue with the fourth question. What strategy? Now we come to the point of pedagogy and the teaching in the classrooms. What strategies should instructors use to implement linguistically inclusive pedagogies such as translanguaging and plurilingualism? How does this benefit multilingual international students?
I believe this is mine.
This is your
Yeah.
question. You can
The
start.
question I was most excited about. We have to start with the principle. When I say we, like instructors, teachers, if you're teachers, start with the principle that students need both permission and structure. If translanguaging, students' first language, plurilingualism is a right, then it's not on me to give them permission, but they still do need explicit permission or they're not going to do it. Michael, that was so interesting, that research you talked about with the numbers, right? And you said that the majority of teachers or instructors, they had either no policy, they were agnostic, or they had a lenient policy. Having no policy or having a lenient policy will not encourage students to be using their first languages. When there is no explicit policy that I would like everyone to be able to use their languages. It's on the syllabus. It's the first thing I say. I model it myself. Unless it happens in a really explicit way, most students are going to revert back to their English only because of all of the, the concerns earlier that I mentioned in my opening remarks. So in terms of what, I try to do as an instructor is, and not always successfully, is, put it in the syllabus, name it in the syllabus as part of my classroom policy. Say it clearly in the first class, like languages are welcome, multilingualism is welcome, and you can use them as resources for learning. I always in my classes try to do like a survey to find out what linguistic repertoire students bring, because again, translanguaging, plurilingualism is so personal. I should not assume that students need to all use their first language in the exact same way. So I always start by doing sort of like a language learning profile in different ways, whether it's a survey or whether it's that, the plurilingual portrait thing that people like to do, to find out like what languages do you use for reading, for speaking, for note taking, for peer support. How confident do you feel? What would help you participate? Rather than just throwing this blanket statement of like, use your languages however you want, right? And then once I find out what my students' linguistic repertoires are and how they use different languages, then I need to actually incorporate it in strategic ways into my classroom. And I start with like really low stakes sort of multilingual participation structure. So, whether it's like small group discussions. I know in the description of your session today, you talked about like some different modalities as well, not just language. And with translanguaging, the theory, we talk about not just languages, but language itself, how it's semiotic and how the different modalities are participating, right? Given that there are many international students in my courses, I make sure that our discussions are not just all oral. I remember how it felt to have to engage in a really complex topic and answer questions about a really complex 40-page article in a language that wasn't my first language. And so I always give students time and different modalities for participation. So I say, you can either share this out loud with a partner, or there's this Google Doc, go ahead and type your suggestions on there, or there's, a visual map. If you're a visual, you student who you prefer to do like a mind map, here you go, piece of paper, pen, and I'm going to give you time. I embrace silence. I embrace silence. So you can be quiet, think about what you want to say, write it down. If you need to put it in notes, so just really giving students multiple modes for participation so that they're not judged just based on their speed and fluency and how fast they're able to participate or how quickly their hands go up. We do other things like just encouraging the use of tools as well. In the interviews, many students talked about using like Google Translate, but they would do it secretly because they felt like I shouldn't be using Google Translate to try to translate this article. And I've heard like advisors at writing centers and so on say, or academic English teachers say like, you shouldn't put this through Google Translate, but why not? If it helps me understand, if the point is that they understand the research, and not that they understand the 5,000 words on this paper, then why can they not put it through Google Translate if it helps them to engage with the ideas? It's different if it's like your language class. It's different. We're teaching like reading skills, right? But if the class is on anti-colonial language teaching practices, if my class is on research methods, then language or the lack of it should not be an impediment to help them engage with the ideas. And so I, encourage them to use their translation tools. Again, depending on the class that I'm teaching, we can, use amazing multilingual strategies in our classrooms. But at the end of the day, they've got their assessment, they've got their final paper. And so if their final paper is still English only, assignments are still English only, a lot of students think like, what's the point? Like, why would I write a draft of this paper in Spanish? If my final paper is going to be in English, I might as well do the work in English and not do double the effort, right? And so I'm trying to think about multilingual assessment options. It is not easy because universities still only ask for English only assessments. I had a student come up to me and say, can I please, Shakina, submit a paper in French because I feel more confident in French? And I said yes, even though I don't read French or understand French. I went up to our administrators at OISE and said, can I, as the instructor, get some support for being able to just understand, like someone who can just, read this paper and help me engage with the ideas. And it was a no, our policy is English only for the assessments, unless it's clearly stated in the SGS bulletin that is the bilingual course, students have to submit their papers in English. And so there was no institutional support. And so I had to take on that work. And it's important that I took on that work, right? So again, speaking of onus of responsibility, it shouldn't be on yes, you can do your paper in French, but please give me a translation in English as well. No, it should be, yes, sure. And I am going to try to figure it out myself because that's on me as an instructor. So with assessment practices, I'm slowly trying to think about ways like, it doesn't have to be a final paper. Who said it has to be a 3,000-word final paper? One of my assignments for my courses this semester is students are creating a multilingual digital story that talks about their culture and identity and engages with the ideas in the course. So we can think about different modalities as well. And with this assignment where they're creating a digital story, they're using AI so that everyone, regardless of how many or little languages they speak, they're going to be able to construct a bilingual story. And I'm going to be able to use AI and technology to help me understand these stories better. And sorry, I've got like 2 pages of suggestions. This is the one I was most excited about. I'm going to try to skip a few. And just to, I talked earlier about knowledge as well, like being, center periphery divide. And so I've been guilty of putting only English articles in my reference list, and not just English only articles, but the articles of people, scholars who publish in the North America. And I wasn't even aware. I just, looked at, this piece on translanguaging cited 500 times. It must be a good piece without thinking about who wrote this. What kind of, perspectives are they coming from? What kinds of knowledge of the world do they bring? Are their ideas of translanguaging representative of how translanguaging is used in the global south or in Asia or in Southeast Asia, where many of my students are from? Is it relevant to them? So I'm trying to be a bit more intentional in diversifying readings and telling my students as well, like, hey, I wasn't able to find a resource on this topic in another language, but if you, with the language knowledge that you have, can find something on this topic in other languages, please, I will add it to the official syllabus so that other students who speak that language can benefit from that perspective in that language as well. And then just to close up, you also asked, how does this benefit multilingual international students? I'll just say being linguistically inclusive doesn't mean we're reducing standards. If I move away from the final paper and do a digital storytelling, I'm not reducing the standards on my expectations. I'm just widening the pathways for students to be able to reach them.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I have other follow-up questions, but I need to be mindful of the time, so I'll pass the word to the Vijay about this topic.
Yeah, I won't add much. Yeah, I think in general, I think teachers, educators need to be willing to relinquish control, right? So in terms of group work, and you might hear different languages being spoken during group work, and you might say, oh, the students bad talking me, are they complaining about the course, right? I think teachers need to sort of realize that they don't always have to control the classroom, right? Students can take charge of their learning, right? So we have that keyword of agency that we talked about earlier, right? So let students actually be agentic in their learning and let them use all the resources that they have available, right? In contexts like group work, for example. For professors in particular, one thing that professors are not good at is one thing that they tend to do is sort of separate their teaching duties from their research duties, but oftentimes they don't see the benefit of actually marrying the two, right? So when you think about valuing, students' linguistic practices, oftentimes we're not intellectually curious about why students are using language in a particular way, right? So if we're marking an essay, for example, and we say, oh, the student made an error or something, maybe it's not an error per se, maybe it's a different way of the student expressing themselves, right? So I think, I guess my general advice is for educators in particular is to really change your mindset, right? Go into a piece of writing, for example, trying to analyze the writing rather than just automatically correct it. And then also, don't be like a dictator in the classroom, relinquish control once again. So I'll leave it at those two pieces of advice. Yeah.
Thank you, Vijay.
And just about the dictator part, I noticed, because my research focused on the teachers. At one point I wanted to do students, teachers, administrators, and super, I was like, Michael, you're never gonna finish this, so just focus on teachers. But I noticed the English only ones spend so much time policing language use that it really takes away from their actual focus on teaching and pedagogy. And then there's that weird kind of authoritative relationship that kind of forms with the students, right? So as far as the kind of translanguaging plurilingual pedagogy, I took so many notes, Shakina, running out of space here. But a couple of things from my participants, just a couple aspects, and this is kind of from EAP or language teaching in particular. I had a participant in Japan who talked. So he's got a background in phonetics, and he talked about how ridiculous it would be to try to teach. He tried to teach like pronunciation to his students, to teach vocabulary in English like the alveolar ridge, and it would take like an entire week to teach all the vocabulary needed to teach this one pronunciation point, whereas he could do it very quickly in Japanese. Everyone gets it, and then let's practice it kind of thing, and then maybe give a follow-up explanation in the target language, kind of multiple channels. But again, I think sometimes the challenge, as Shakina talked about, is going beyond this kind of process product binary. So the process can be in multiple languages, but the product always needs to be kind of English only. And there's some great suggestions, I think, from Shakina there. And then just also thinking about going beyond the binary of target language versus other languages, again, that these things can be mixed kind of throughout the process and the product, right? Another aspect from a teacher, she'll set kind of negotiated discussion norms at the outset of the course, ultimately because the point of the course is to build English fluency. So for example, students will try to start and end a discussion in English, but then they'll use multiple languages for delicate topics to avoid misunderstandings, to explain more deeply, or to check understanding. And again, it doesn't have to be like switching from English to Japanese back to English, but actually, sometimes using a mix and code switching in that sense too, right? Or negotiated policies for activities where students decide what kind of percentage of the target language they want to target, to set students up as policymakers. They can set goals and reflect on their learning, right? But again, it's always this target language versus other languages. And I think if we can conflate that, that's going to be very important kind of going forward for pedagogy. And then as Shakina talked about rethinking assessment. So again, having multilingual kind of assessment options, or again, these kind of hybrid language kind of assessment options, or for profs to focus more on kind of content, critical thinking and creativity, rather than the conformity to standardized English, right?
Thanks so much. You're done?
I was also going to say, like, don't eat all the food because I'm getting hungry. Y'all are snacking out there anyway. Tabemono chotto matte kudasai.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for last points too. And we have lots of international students among us and probably online. So in the micro level, I would like to hear your thoughts about what can international students do, because we already mentioned that we sometimes internalize and made to be like international. So I'd like to ask the question of what would you suggest to international students to utilize their additional languages for academic purposes, and what strategies could they follow in academic writing and presentation? And Michael?
For sure. I think the first point is like kind of building like the ISA, building kind of international student communities and people that you can talk to and get together with and share kind of experiences and strategies together, right? And so that kind of peer support aspect can go in the kind of club or group setting to peer support within a classroom setting, right? So did you understand what the prof just said? To content support, paraphrasing in multiple languages as a mediation tool for challenging content. Again, leveraging technology for translation, register if you want to adjust certain things like that. Writing, so drafting in a mix of languages, focusing on content before language, for example, researching in a mix of language, bringing perspectives from the literature beyond publications in English. And so oftentimes when students, like first-year students at OISE that are new to OISE and maybe new to Canada, and they're trying to think of what topic can I write about for my term paper, and say, well, why don't you bring perspectives from where you're from, articles from where you're from, that kind of culture aspect. That's to show that kind of students as experts as well, right? For presentations, I'm using multilingual materials, so content and languages from other cultures. Dual language slides, and then as Shakina mentioned, multimodality to bridge comprehension multiple languages as well. But even having a part of your presentation where you deliver it in a mix of languages, right? So again, shifting from the deficit to the asset perspective, and sometimes I think that requires just even having a conversation with the professor and saying, hey, I'd like to do this. Would that be okay? And oftentimes professors, I think would be open to opening their classrooms up to more kind of languages and cultures and perspectives, right? So that's what I have to say with that.
Thank you, Michael. And Vijay, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I think, just in terms of like, this question made me think of, a term from Nelson Flores. He talks about language architecture, right? And the basic idea is that, an architect, for example, can build, an aesthetically pleasing building, but beneath the surface, it has to sort of stick to certain rules and measurements or whatever to stay structurally sound, right? So I think for students, I think it would be useful for them to sort of play with this idea that they are architects of language, right? Yes, they might need to conform in certain ways, but where are the spaces where they can, be creative and be unique in how they language? Michael brought up, the topic of like presentations, for example, right? So oftentimes presentations in an academic setting has this sort of formulaic structure, but there are different resources that we can use, right? So if I'm kind of nervous about the sound of my voice, what could I use to maybe enhance it? Maybe use a lot of gestures or, pay more closer attention to the visuals that I'm using, right? So I think there are ways that we can maybe conform to the rules in some way, but sort of deviate from them in our own unique manner. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Vijay. Shakina?
Maybe just shortly, I didn't talk about this earlier, but one of my other studies, which was conducted in the academic English course here at OISE that I used to teach that Vijay now teaches. I implemented what's called communities of practice. I mean, you're familiar with communities of practice, many of you from sociocultural theory, but we did this where students in this course, they have to pick like an area of, and I hate the term academic English, but that's what it's called. They have to pick an area of academic English they want to improve on, and then they have to create a set of actions that they will take over the period of 10 to 12 weeks in order to meet that particular language goal. And so I put students, actually, I asked them to choose, and they form communities of practice based on two things, based on similar goals in language development, but also based on language. So some students decided to have a community of practice with students who have the same first language. Or some students decided to, based on their goal, to be in a group that was linguistically diverse. And I gave them suggestions about how they could use languages to support each other in their communities of practice. So with some students, like, they wanted to be able to communicate with Canadians or like with people who speak different languages. And so in their group, they were doing some kind of intercultural practice where they were having communication exchanges, conversation, but telling each other about their cultures and really, having a space where they were able to bring different languages and cultures to practice their speaking. And another group, for example, they wanted to work on vocabulary, and they all spoke the same first language, and so they were able to do like a vocabulary list, bilingual list, and they would hold each other accountable to learning 10 new academic words per week, but by connecting it to the linguistic origin in Mandarin, for example. And so the community of practice structure really helped, because sometimes students, if they're put on their own, if we tell them like, okay, you figure out how to use your additional languages, it can feel scary, daunting, overwhelming, and again, like I was saying earlier, they might resort to English only. But with the supported community of practice, like bringing minds together, bringing languages together, bringing social skills together, it was really helpful in not just creating that sense of like legitimacy of like, I'm a legitimate member of this group. I have valuable expertise to contribute to this group, but it also led to linguistic gains as well.
Thanks so much, Shakina. I'm glad that everybody emphasized the importance of community building and student-led organizations. I truly believe in that, and because we sometimes have the fear to ask others, or like in terms of the position of power, we are more like inclined to ask friends more easily, more comfortably. And we know that it's not something individual, but experiences are similar, so we can support each other and create a practice of community. And we are starting to the last question. How can we, this is more related to Vijay's research and expertise. We already mentioned accent a lot, so we can be quicker compared to other questions. How can we overcome accent discrimination and linguistic prejudice faced by international students? What are your suggestions for international students who feel pressure to change their language practices?
Okay, yeah, so I have to sort of really train myself not to go and start rambling, because I could talk for an hour on this. So yeah, Shakina and Emre, you already mentioned, the importance of listening, right? So obviously the short answer is that we all need to listen better, but it's a little bit more complicated of how we actually do so, because for me, I like this concept from organization and management studies. It's called listening structures. So it's basically the idea that, you know, how we individually listen is influenced by the institutions and structures that surround us, right? So we can think of listening structures in a physical sense. So maybe if I wasn't using my teacher voice at the moment, I was speaking very softly and slowly, you might not hear me, right? Because this room is fairly large. So the room itself is a listening structure that's affecting how you can listen to me, right? So when we think of listening structures in a more figurative sense, right, it really requires us to challenge our taken for granted notions of what is an accent, how do we make ourselves understood, and so on. So I guess my answer in terms of like how can we, you know, avoid accent-based discrimination is really to really change and interrogate our listening structures, right? So in an educational setting, you know, Shakina and Emre already mentioned this word intelligibility, right? I think intelligibility is actually a listening structure that prevents us from actually listening better to different types of accented speakers. So what I mean by that is that, you know, oftentimes we think of intelligibility as this individual traits, right? It's an individual quality of a speaker, but in actual practice, intelligibility is the end product of successful communication, right? If I understand you, you understand me, we're both intelligible for each other. So that means intelligibility can take different forms, right? So if I understand that point, I need to understand that my ears have to appreciate an array of voices and appreciate that they can be used in different ways to achieve intelligibility, right? So once again, changing how we conceptualize terms like intelligibility can force us to listen better, right, to different types of accented voices. In terms of just advice for those of you who may be insecure about your accents or, you know, your spoken English in general, I would say, you know, be like that annoying 5-year-old child that always asks their parents, why this, why that, why do we need to do this, right? Really interrogate and challenge people who are telling you to change your accent, change your voice. So if somebody says, oh, you need to change your accent to get a job, okay, well, why? How exactly should I change my accent? Why is my accent important for doing this type of work, right? Really interrogate people and really force them to give you an answer. And oftentimes they can't give you a satisfactory answer, and then you win the argument. You don't need to change your accent ideally. So yeah, use your skills as graduate students, for example, right? A big part of grad school is critical thinking. So adopt that critical thinking when people are telling you to change your voice. I know it's not gonna stop accent-based discrimination, but it's a way that you can engage in micro-level resistance, right? And just like going full circle with my initial remarks, language is a site of resistance. Say my accent is going to sound this way because you're not convincing me that I need to change it otherwise to do whatever communicative tasks, right? So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much. Shakina, would you like to?
Yeah, just a few remarks. I think don't apologize for your language. I read a study a few years ago that showed that international students or people who spoke with an accent tended to first apologize for like, I'm sorry, my English is not good, because actually it was a helpful thing for them. They felt like if their audience knows that their English is not their first language, they might be more forgiving and more accepting of grammatical mistakes. But don't apologize for your language. Be bold. I think Sol was here earlier. Has Sol left? But Sol's I'm on Sol's dissertation committee, and I read Sol's the first 3 chapters of her dissertation, and she writes like beautiful parts in Spanish with no translation. And so I don't speak Spanish, and so it was some more work for me, going through these parts where it was in Spanish without translation. But it was like amazing. It was so refreshing to have someone so bold about their language and not feel like they needed to translate, because it just like I could see Sol in the writing. It's like this is you, and you're not apologetic. You're so bold about your language and who you are, and you're telling us that this is who I am. I bring Spanish and English to my dissertation work, and I'm not going to change. I'm not going to assimilate into an English-only academic writing structure. I'm speaking on behalf of Sol. Sol, if you're there, I'm sorry. I hope I'm not misrepresenting you. And the last thing I'll say is, the biggest compliment I've gotten from my students, or best evaluations I've ever received, are students who have said to me either out loud or in my evaluation that because you had an accent or because you were someone of color, I felt more heard, I felt more valid, I felt more accepted as someone who also speaks with an accent or who also is a racialized person. And so, again, it ties back to the theme of being bold. Like if you try to change your accent, you are probably going to lead someone else down the path of also changing their accent. But if you are bold in like, this is how I sound, this is the way I speak, whether in English or in other languages, you're going to help someone else feel really, validated in the way that they feel. And imagine the ripple effect that would have in just creating a space where multilingualism is the norm.
Thank you so much. Michael, last remarks.
Yeah, just very briefly, again, the aspect of boldness, and the kind of micro resistance. I like that as insofar as, I guess when there's a lot of those kind of microaggressions, and I think oftentimes the people that are the perpetrators of microaggressions don't even realize that they're doing it, just kind of ingrained, or it's part of an aspect of whatever that they're kind of acting on or kind of communicating. And so just being able, being bold, being able to call it out, to kind of shift some of those kind of attitudes or perspectives. Oh, I didn't realize I was doing that. I'm so sorry. So I think the kind of, combating the microaggressions with kind of micro resistance, and being bold, as everyone said here, I think is very important for sure.
Thank you. Now it's the end of our guided discussion, and I would like to open the floor for questions for in-person audience and online. I think we can use like microphones. We can hear it, but show it from any questions online, please feel free to jump in, or yeah, we can start with Elena.
Yeah, thank you so much for such a rich discussion, and nice to see everyone in person as well. I was just thinking of the point that Shakina made about apologizing for the language, but a lot of times we actually, my English is also not my first language, but I also had many times people would say, "Oh, you teach English? Your English is very good."
Yeah,
So like, how would you resist to that? And I didn't know, because sometimes it would be in a professional setting. And if it's a person who is, let's say like a program coordinator, then you wouldn't necessarily resist to them, not at that point at least.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of times when we, even like when we try to maybe help, as we said, right, we use the words like support, or, your English is still developing. I think we also need to be mindful of what effect it has on our students and like. But my question was with regards to like power dynamics, when I think everything that was said, being bold and using the language, maybe OISE is also more receptive to those kinds of things. But when students go more into professional settings, or when students go, if they try to live here in the English speaking environment, what strategies or something that we can do to prepare them to keep resisting to this? It's to anyone, not specific question.
I'll say maybe two things to start off with. Yeah, I've gotten a comment many times like, "Oh, you're from Malaysia. Oh, your English is so good." I used to get just annoyed and not respond, but now I just I use that opportunity to teach them. I'm like, yeah, actually, I'm from Malaysia where everyone speaks English. We learn English in kindergarten. And in fact, like people from Southeast Asia where I live are extremely proficient in English. For many of us, it's our second language. And in fact, I've lived in England for a few years, and people in Malaysia speak better English than people in England, and we have more grammatically correct. So I just use it as an opportunity to sort of like be a little bit sarcastic, but also teach them about a different context and the role of global Englishes, for example. In terms of like, OISE is amazing, it's more receptive, but what about, I also do work with students like out in schools, elementary school students of newcomer and refugee backgrounds, and there's so much of resistance both from students themselves as well as from their parents. Like I've had children, for example, they're from a refugee background and they're already so, they feel so excluded, and they refuse to use their first language in the beautiful translanguaging activities I had planned, because they feel like I don't want to be seen as that refugee or that person or that ESL student, right? I just want to be normal. I just want to be a 9-year-old who is not from from this place, right? From somewhere else. And so the resistance comes from students or parents sometimes say, what are you doing? I just want my children to be successful in English. Like I sacrifice so much for my children to be here. Why would you ask them to speak in Arabic when I'm just trying for them to assimilate, they don't use the word assimilate, but basically to, assimilate into Canadian culture. So the work is really cut out for us in terms of like researchers, I think working not just with children and parents, but even in terms of like working with teachers to try to change the culture of the classroom where, if parents come in and they see lots of languages present in the classroom around them, they get the idea that this is actually not an English space. This is a multilingual space where for my students, for my children to get ahead, actually it's really valuable for them to have a multilingual identity, helping parents to see the benefits as well. Not just saying like, hey, plurilingualism and translanguaging is great, but saying like, hey, it actually does help your students with their English too. I do recognize the goals that you have for your children. I am a parent myself, and I know that you want your children to learn English so that they get ahead. And actually, here's a research that shows that plurilingualism and translanguaging are not just good for students' social, emotional well-being and identity affirmation, but it is also good for their English learning in a second language. So really, I guess meeting children and parents where they're at. And for the children who resist and say, no, we don't want to use language because we don't want to be stigmatized, I don't push their first language on them. I say, okay, sure, it's okay. Use English, use the language you feel the most comfortable with until you feel ready. So really starting with what they feel comfortable with and not pushing our research agenda or scholarly agenda on them.
Thank you, Shakina. Vijay?
Yeah, I think like one thing that we should also appreciate is that, it's okay to have, insecurities about your languaging or, have doubts or anxieties because, not to get too sociological, but like our internalized feelings are a product of our social environment, right? So that's just, if you feel insecure about, the way that you're speaking, for example, that's just a sign that, the environment that you're situated in is making you feel that way, right? So I think it's okay to feel those feelings, right? Don't, like, I think sometimes the solution, like I might say, be proud of your accent. That's not something, Shakina mentioned this already, you're not maybe ready for that messaging yet, right? So I think, we all have to have patience with each other and say that, it's okay to, feel your feelings, right? Until you sort of, are ready to take, the next step, right? So I'll leave it at.
You, any other question?
That's it. Can you hear me? Okay. So first of all, thank you, Michael, thank you, Vijay and Shakina for leading this panel. Thank you, Emre, for facilitating. I just have a question when you mentioned about multilingual assessment, and I want to hear different perspective, like from Michael as you lead the OSNC right now. So how can you motivate the advisors when students come to them, especially international students, if they look at the syllabus and the rubrics, but it's very monolingual? How do you prepare advisors and students to maybe take the initiative to make the term monolingual to multilingual in their own way as student? And Vijay and Shakina, as you mentioned, you are trying to include more multilingual assessment. I wonder how would you decide the assessment rubrics and how can you communicate that rubrics with students during the classes? Thank you.
Yeah, I think to Shakina's point, right, the hiring practice, we're having multilingual advisors in the writing center spaces, right? That can be able to engage with you on multiple levels in multiple languages. And then just again, we're kind of sometimes in a difficult position because we can't, sometimes students will have struggles with assignments or professors or supervisors, and we can't really go and be like, you have to change this practice or but rather, again, being able to have these the conversations we're having now in a writing center, and being able to, talk about, options of being able to, talk to your professor and, as Shakina mentioned too, right? I have an idea for my final project, where I want to use, multiple languages. What would you think about that, right? And I think having those spaces, to kind of maybe strategize how I would do that, and then, might give, students a little bit more, courage to go and talk to the professor and try to affect some change that way as well, right? So, maybe those are two ways that we can do that.
So, anything you would like to?
Yeah, I guess like very quickly in terms of like the topic of rubrics. So, when students have to give presentations in my classes, sometimes there's a score for intelligibility. So going back to that word intelligibility, and like I mentioned before, we often think of intelligibility as a quality of a voice or the type of speaking. But what I try to do in terms of rubrics is kind of reframe what intelligibility is supposed to be. So instead of marking or grading a student on the clarity of their voice or how loud their voice is, I sort of pay attention to what sort of multimodal resources are they using to make sure that they're understood? What sort of interactional strategies are they using to make sure the audience understands them, right? So do they maybe use a lot of gesture to emphasize a point, or do they rephrase their utterances, right, to make sure the audience caught what they were saying, right? So just sort of reframing like certain categories and sort of appreciating that communication, once again, is very interactive. And how can I reward students for being interactive rather than just sounding a particular way? That's kind of one kind of area I try to do better. Yeah.
Two quick things about the rubric. I just always try to clarify to my students for every assignment what exactly I'm assessing them for, whether it's for their argument or their use of evidence, or whether it is for structure, whether it is for language in the academic English course. But in terms of language, what am I assessing? Am I assessing grammatical accuracy, or am I assessing the ability to synthesize information from 3 different sources? And most often I'm not assessing grammatical accuracy, and I have to remind my students that I'm not assessing it for grammatical accuracy. I'm assessing it for this. So being really clear and transparent. And secondly, this is a lot of work, but I do try to do it. I try to allow drafts of final papers. So not just wait till December and they submit a paper and it's 40% or 60% of their weightage, but actually having check-in points saying, and it's optional. I say that, okay, I'm going to have a session today where if you have a draft that you would like my feedback on, bring it to my office, send it to me a day before, I'm going to read it. So I have revision cycles and formative feedback so that students have many opportunities to clarify questions, uncertainties, and I give them at least 2 rounds of feedback before they submit their final paper.
Thank you, Shakina. We actually ran out of time, but if there's any question online, I'd like to hear them as well. If there's not, if it's very quick, like one last question from Julio. I think there's no question online.
There's no question online.
Actually, there
There's
is
what?
no question online. There are 2 comments actually. Do you want me to read those, or I can invite the people who wrote the comments? They can read their own comment.
Yeah.
So
Please.
Leanne, can you read your comment if you're there?
Yeah, hi. Thank you all so much for this really great panel and discussion. I was just commenting on the idea of creating a syllabus for a listening course. Like, what would that look like? What would the activities look like? What would the readings look like? And I was thinking that'd be a good place for like a first year. I am at the University of Minnesota, and there's a first year seminar that all freshmen have to take. And they get to pick the topic that they want. That could be a really cool class. But I would love to. If people have ideas or if people want to collaborate or think about that, that would be really fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Leanne, for contributions. Yeah, I think we can just wrap up and share the key takeaways from today. I got like lots of notes, but I will try to summarize them very quickly. I think the first point we understood from today's conversation, English is not static, dynamic, hybrid, and complex, and we should be open to other ways of Englishes. And international students, although feel some negative emotions like anxiety, fear of judgment, etc., they should be bold and speak up and try to find ways to resist against the English-only system. And teachers also has a role in creating more inclusive spaces for students. We can use multimodality and digital tools for it, or we can just basically ask students what they prefer, what are their strengths, and we should have a space that can they can, in fact, show their agency in the classroom and beyond. We also mentioned the importance of multilingualism as the norm, not only English only. We need to change the norms as a collective responsibility of teachers, educators, and policy makers. As an indication of our appreciation for panelists, I'd like to just pass some gifts, if Becky can help me with those. This is, before ending, I'd like to say that this is the last 3 days with OISE ISA, and there's an ongoing election. And I'd like to thank Becky for her work throughout the year. She's the vice president of OISE ISA. And if you're an international student, if you have a vote, you can go check our social media and you can vote for the president. We have one of the candidates, Phoebe, here, and there's another candidate. So you can go for it and vote for them. And yeah.
Thank
First of all,
you.
thank you so
Thank you so much. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Malcolm. So this is the end of our event. Thank you all for your participation. And I'd like to thank our volunteers, Michelle, PB, Melissa, Julio. Is there anyone I forgot? And Ime online for admitting people to the room. Thank you so much, all volunteers, and thank you so much for participating our event today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.